What happens when a man who has everything decides he's entitled to more? Richard Sterling, a titan of industry, stood at the pinnacle of New York society. He had the penthouse, the private jet, and on his arm, a woman half his age, the beautiful Isabella. His wife, Eleanor, was a ghost in his gilded life, a quiet, predictable woman left at home. Tonight, at the city's most exclusive charity gala, Richard was ready to flaunt his new life. He stepped into the glittering ballroom, a king with his new queen, believing he was the master of his universe. But he was about to learn a terrifying lesson. The quietest people often have the most thunderous secrets, and hell hath no fury. Like a woman you've tragically, fatally underestimated. The black Escalade glided through the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan like a predator in the night. Inside, cocooned from the symphony of honking taxis and the distant wail of sirens, Richard Sterling adjusted the crisp cuffs of his Tom Ford tuxedo. The faint scent of his expensive cologne, a custom blend with notes of oud and leather, filled the confined space. Beside him, Isabella Rossi shifted the crimson silk of her gown rustling against the plush leather seats. "Are you nervous, darling?" Richard asked, his voice a low, confident purr. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the glittering skyscrapers piercing the charcoal sky. Isabella forced a delicate laugh. "Nervous with you never." She placed her hand on his thigh, her long manicured fingers a stark splash of scarlet against his black trousers. "I'm just excited. The St. Jude's Children's Hope Gala. It's the event of the season." "It's a room full of peacocks and sharks," Richard corrected, a smirk playing on his lips. "Tonight, we are the sharks." He finally turned to look at her, and his chest swelled with a familiar, intoxicating pride. Isabella was exquisite, a piece of art he had acquired. Her dark hair was swept into an intricate chignon, revealing a cascade of diamonds at her ears, a gift from him, of course. Her dress was daring a sliver of fabric that clung to her curves, a statement of youth and vitality. She was everything his wife was not. His wife. Eleanor. The name felt like a relic from another era. He pictured her then probably at home in their cavernous Greenwich estate, curled up with a book, blissfully unaware. Predictable. Safe. Boring. For 20 years, Eleanor had been the perfect corporate wife. She hosted his soulless dinner parties with quiet grace, remembered the names of his business partners' children, and managed their domestic empire with an efficiency that was both admirable and to him profoundly unexciting. She was the bedrock upon which he'd built his company, Sterling Innovations. But bedrock is meant to be stood upon, not admired. "What about Eleanor?" Isabella's voice was a whisper, the only crack in her polished facade. Richard waved a dismissive hand. "What about her? She doesn't do these things. Too loud for her. She prefers her garden club meetings and charity bake sales. She wouldn't be caught dead here." He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Don't waste a second of your beautiful mind thinking about her." He was convinced of it. He'd told Eleanor he had a last-minute business dinner with Japanese investors. It was his standard excuse, a well-worn lie that she always accepted with a placid nod. He had become so accustomed to her passive acceptance that he no longer considered the possibility of her questioning him. He was the sun, and she a distant planet, simply revolved around his gravitational pull. The Escalade pulled up to the grand entrance of the Pierre Hotel on Fifth Avenue. A sea of flashing cameras erupted as the doorman, clad in a formal uniform, opened their door. The cold September air rushed in, carrying the scent of city rain and expensive perfume. Richard stepped out first, a conquering hero. then turned and offered his hand to Isabella. She emerged like a starlet on a red carpet, her smile dazzling her eyes, drinking in the attention. They were a vision of power and beauty. He, the self-made tech billionaire, whose software ran on nearly every computer in the world. She, the vibrant young woman who signaled his continued dominance. As they walked up the marble steps past the velvet ropes and the fawning reporters, Richard felt an electric thrill. This was right. This was how his life was supposed to be. Inside the grand ballroom was a breathtaking spectacle. Crystal chandeliers, each the size of a small car, dripped light onto a sea of beautifully dressed people. The air hummed with the murmur of 100 conversations, the clinking of champagne flutes, and the soft strains of a string quartet playing something by Mozart. The theme was a celestial night, and the room was awash in midnight blues and shimmering silver with tiny star-like lights twinkling from the high, ornate ceiling. Richard navigated the room with practiced ease, a hand firmly on the small of Isabella's back. He nodded at a banking CEO here, shared a brief alpha male handshake with a real estate mogul there. He saw his main rival Marcus Thorne holding court near the Raw bar, and gave him a curt, dismissive nod. Marcus's eyes flickered to Isabella, a glint of what Richard interpreted as pure envy in them. "Everyone is staring," Isabella whispered, her voice a mix of awe and anxiety. "Let them stare," Richard murmured back, his lips close to her ear. "They're looking at the future." He guided her to their assigned table number 1, placed directly in front of the grand stage, the best seat in the house. It was a power play, a statement he'd arranged with a hefty last-minute donation. He was Richard Sterling. He didn't just attend events, he owned them. He held Isabella's chair for her, then sat down, surveying his kingdom. He felt invincible, untouchable. The night was young, the champagne was cold, and the world was exactly as it should be at his feet. He had no way of knowing that he wasn't the owner of this event, but merely a guest at his own public execution. An hour bled into the next. The initial flurry of greetings subsided into the comfortable rhythm of the gala. Waiters moved like ghosts, refilling glasses of Dom Perignon and offering trays of delicate hors d'oeuvres. Richard was in his element, holding court at table 1. He regaled a junior senator and his wife with a slightly exaggerated story about closing a deal in Tokyo, his voice booming with the easy confidence of a man who had never known true failure. Isabella, ever the perfect accessory, laughed at all the right moments, her eyes fixed on him, with a look of pure adoration that fed his ego like dry kindling to a flame. Yet underneath the veneer of control, a strange, dissonant note began to play in Richard's mind. He started noticing things. The stares he had initially dismissed as admiration now felt different. They were longer, more pointed. When he caught someone's eye, they didn't offer a respectful nod. They looked away quickly, turning to whisper to the person beside them. He saw Marcus Thorne across the room, leaning in to speak with a well-known society columnist, a woman named Beatrice Fairfax, whose pen could build or dismantle a reputation overnight. Marcus gestured subtly with his champagne flute in Richard's direction, a predatory smile on his face. Beatrice listened intently, her eyes sharp and intelligent, flicking over to table 1. Richard felt a prickle of annoyance. Thorne was likely spreading some rumor about a hostile takeover or a product flaw. The man was a bottom feeder. "Is everything all right, Richard?" Isabella asked, sensing the shift in his mood. "You seem tense." "Just business," he lied, patting her hand. "Thorne is a snake. Pay him no mind." But it wasn't just Thorne. The whispers felt pervasive, like a change in the room's atmospheric pressure. A group of women wives of his board members huddled near a towering floral arrangement. He knew them all. They had been to his home. Eleanor had hosted them for luncheons. As he watched one of them, a woman named Catherine glanced over at him and Isabella, her expression a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. She quickly whispered something to the others, and they all subtly turned to look before dissolving into a flurry of hushed gossip. A cold knot began to form in Richard's stomach. This wasn't business rivalry. This felt personal. He scanned the room again, trying to pinpoint the source of the unease. The decor, the guest list, the seating chart. Everything was meticulously planned, as is typical for an event of this magnitude. But who was behind it? The official event chair was a kindly old dowager, Beatrice's mother-in-law in fact, who barely had the energy to plan her own bridge games. The real work was always done by a major sponsor, a benefactor who poured millions into the event in exchange for control and prestige. Usually, that was him, or Thorne, or one of the other titans in the room. This year, however, the main sponsor had been a mystery. The invitations had spoken of a generous anonymous benefactor from a private entity known only as the Vanguard Legacy Foundation. The name was new unknown in the tight-knit circle of New York philanthropy. Richard had assumed it was some new money tech billionaire from Silicon Valley trying to make a splash. He'd even felt a pang of irritation that someone else had outbid him for the top spot. "Darling, the host is about to speak," Isabella said, nudging him gently. Richard's attention snapped back to the stage. The lights in the ballroom dimmed, casting the tables in an intimate, shadowed glow. A single brilliant spotlight illuminated the podium. The host for the evening, the famous talk show host James Corden, walked onto the stage to a round of enthusiastic applause. "Good evening, New York City," Corden began, his cheerful British accent echoing through the ballroom. "And welcome to the St. Jude's Children's Hope Gala. You all look absolutely stunning, and I must say the wallets in this room tonight are looking even better." The crowd laughed appreciatively. Corden launched into his monologue, a well-rehearsed series of jokes about Billionaire's fashion and the city's absurd real estate prices. Richard barely listened. He was still scanning the faces in the crowd, the unease in his gut now a churning anxiety. He felt like a character in a play who had forgotten his lines, a horrifying feeling for a man who prided himself on always writing the script. "But in all seriousness," Corden said, his tone shifting to one of sincerity, "we are here for an incredible cause, to give hope to children and families facing the unimaginable. And this year, our gala this beautiful night has been made possible by one organization's profound generosity, an organization that until tonight has preferred to remain in the shadows." A hush fell over the room. The air crackled with anticipation. This was the moment. The great unveiling of the mysterious benefactor. Richard leaned forward, his curiosity momentarily overriding his anxiety. Who was this Vanguard? This foundation is new, but its mission is timeless, to invest in the forgotten, to empower the overlooked, and to build a legacy of strength and independence. Corden continued reading from the teleprompter with genuine admiration. Their contribution this year is the largest single donation in the history of the St. Jude's Gala. It is my absolute honor and privilege to introduce the founder and CEO of the Vanguard Legacy Foundation. Richard held his breath. He expected to see a slick tech bro or an ancient oil tycoon walk out from the wings of the stage. He adjusted his tie, ready to size up his new rival. Corden beamed. "Please give a thunderous welcome to the heart and soul behind this incredible gift." Miss Eleanor Vance. The name hit Richard Sterling with the force of a physical blow. For a split second, it didn't register. Vance. That was Eleanor's maiden name, a name he hadn't heard spoken in 20 years. It couldn't be. A mistake. Some other Eleanor Vance. But then she emerged from the side of the stage, walking into the brilliant white spotlight. It was her. It was his wife, Eleanor. The room, which had been silent, erupted in a tidal wave of gasps and frantic whispers. Every single head in the crystal ballroom swiveled not to the woman on the stage, but to table 1. To him. Richard felt 1,000 pairs of eyes on him, hot and sharp as needles. He sat frozen in his chair, his face a mask of utter uncomprehending shock. The champagne glass in his hand trembled, and a single cold drop fell onto his pristine tuxedo. Beside him, Isabella's perfectly painted smile had vanished, replaced by a pale, gaping confusion. "Richard," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Who is that?" Richard couldn't answer. He could only stare at the woman on stage. It was his quiet, predictable book-reading wife. But the woman in the spotlight was a stranger. She wore a bespoke navy blue gown that shimmered like the night sky, her shoulders bare and elegant. Her normally simple brown hair was styled in soft, sophisticated waves, and a necklace of sapphires and diamonds rested at her throat, a piece he had certainly never seen before. She looked poised. She looked radiant. She looked powerful. And she was not looking at him at all. Time seemed to warp in the grand ballroom of the Pierre. For Richard Sterling, the seconds stretched into an agonizing eternity. The collective gasp of the city's elite echoed in his ears, a sound that would haunt his nightmares. The spotlight holding his wife on stage felt like an interrogation lamp, and he was the one being exposed. Eleanor approached the podium with a calm, measured grace that he had never witnessed. There was no trace of the hesitant, accommodating woman who asked his permission before changing the drapes in the living room. This woman moved with the self-assurance of a CEO, of a leader, of someone who belonged in that spotlight far more than he ever had. She placed her hands lightly on the sides of the lectern, her fingers steady. The sapphire on her hand, a massive stone he didn't recognize, caught the light and sent a shard of brilliant blue across the darkened room like a sniper's laser. Her eyes, the same warm hazel eyes he had looked into for 2 decades, swept across the audience. They were not warm now. They were cool, deliberate, and held a steely resolve he couldn't fathom. She surveyed the crowd, her gaze passing over Marcus Thorne's stunned face, over the gossiping wives of his board members, and finally, for a single, fleeting second, her eyes met his. In that 1 second, Richard saw it all. There was no anger, no hatred, not even sadness. There was only a chillingly impersonal assessment. It was the look a biologist gives a specimen under a microscope just before dissecting it. Then her gaze moved on, dismissing him as if he were nothing more than part of the scenery. The whispers in the room had grown to a deafening roar. "Is that Eleanor Sterling?" She used her maiden name, Vance. My God, look at Richard's face. And who is that girl with him? Isabella was tugging at his sleeve, her panic now palpable. "Richard, what is happening? Is this some kind of joke? Why is your wife on stage?" Richard couldn't form words. His throat was a desert. His mind, usually a high-speed processor of data, and strategy was a blue screen of death. The system had crashed. He watched, dumbfounded, as Eleanor tapped the microphone lightly. The sound reverberated instantly, silencing the room. The power she commanded was absolute. "Thank you, James," she began, her voice clear and resonant, amplified by the speakers. It was her voice, but imbued with a confidence that made it sound entirely new. "And thank you all for being here tonight to support a cause so dear to my heart." She smiled, a genuine warm smile directed at the audience at large. It was a performer's smile, and it was devastatingly effective. "For many years," she continued, "I have moved through this city through rooms like this one in a supporting role, and I was content in that role. It is a vital one, and I honor all who fulfill it. But I come from a line of dreamers and builders. My father, Arthur Vance, was a brilliant engineer. He had a mind that could see the future. He designed a revolutionary data compression algorithm in the late 1990s, an idea that was poised to change the world." Richard felt a jolt as if struck by lightning. Her father's algorithm. The algorithm. The one he'd told her was a dead end, a pipe dream. The one he'd helped her father with, suggesting a few minor tweaks before buying the patent off the old man for a pittance when he fell on hard times. The very algorithm that became the foundational code for sterling innovations. His entire empire was built on Arthur Vance's pipe dream. "But my father was a better inventor than he was a businessman," Eleanor said, a note of carefully controlled sorrow in her voice. "He was outmaneuvered. His legacy was bought, rebranded, and sold to the world under a different name while he was left with almost nothing. He passed away believing he was a failure. But he wasn't. He was just ahead of his time." The air in Richard's lungs turned to ice. This wasn't just an announcement. This was a narrative, a story. And he was the unnamed villain. He could feel Marcus Thorne's eyes burning into him from across the room, the dawning realization and vicious delight spreading across his rival's face. "I created the Vanguard Legacy Foundation," Eleanor declared, her voice ringing with purpose, "to honor him, to ensure that brilliant minds, the overlooked dreamers, and the quiet geniuses are never again pushed to the sidelines. We find them, we fund them, and we give them the one thing my father never had: a shield, a vanguard to protect their legacy." Applause began to ripple through the room, starting as a few tentative claps and growing into a wave of genuine enthusiastic support. They were buying it. They were buying her. "Tonight," she said, her voice swelling with emotion, "we are not just donating to St. Jude's. We are launching a new partnership. The Vanguard Foundation is funding the Arthur Vance Pediatric AI Research Wing, a new state-of-the-art facility that will use predictive analytics and machine learning to create personalized cancer treatments for children." The room exploded into a standing ovation. People were on their feet, their faces filled with admiration. They were applauding her vision, her generosity, her story. Richard remained seated, a stone statue in a sea of adulation. Isabella, looking lost and terrified, was a bright red stain of shame next to him. Eleanor held up a hand, gracefully quieting the crowd. She took a sip of water, a perfectly timed pause that held every person in the room captive. "True wealth," she said, her eyes once again sweeping the room, "is not about what you can acquire. It's about what you can build. And true power is not about controlling others. It's about empowering them." Her final words hung in the air, a direct, devastating indictment. Then, with another brilliant smile to the crowd, she turned and walked off the stage, disappearing into the wings, as the applause thundered on. She never looked at him again. The spell was broken. The house lights came up, and Richard Sterling was left exposed in the ruins. The whispers now, a chorus of judgment, the weight of 1,000 pressing down on him, suffocating him. His kingdom had not just been conquered, it had been dismantled and rewritten by the one person he had never even considered a player in the game. The standing ovation continued for what felt like a lifetime. James Corden returned to the stage, wiping a tear from his eye, whether real or for show, it didn't matter, and praised Eleanor's incredible spirit and generosity. The Gala's auctioneer took over, and the energy in the room was electric, with attendees now eager to be associated with the night's new star, throwing money at auction items with newfound vigor. But for Richard, the room had gone silent and cold. The thunderous applause was a distant ringing in his ears. He was in a bubble of pure, unadulterated shock. Eleanor, his Eleanor, founder and CEO. The Vanguard Legacy Foundation. Vance. The name was a hammer blow, severing the connection he thought they had. She wasn't Eleanor Sterling tonight. She was Eleanor Vance, a separate entity, a power unto herself. Where had the money come from? How was this possible? His mind raced desperately, trying to compute the variables. Their finances were intertwined, he thought. He was in control. He gave her a generous allowance, which she used for the house, for her charities, for her quiet little life. It was a fortune to most people, but it was pocket money compared to what would be required to fund a foundation capable of making a donation of this magnitude. He replayed her speech in his head, dissecting it. Her father's algorithm. He had the patent. He owned it. It was legally, indisputably his. But then a darker, more terrifying thought wormed its way into his consciousness. Arthur Vance had other ideas, notebooks full of them. Richard had dismissed them as the ramblings of a broken man. Had Eleanor taken them? Had she spent the last 20 years in the quiet solitude of their estate, cultivating her father's forgotten seeds into a forest he never knew existed? The idea was preposterous. It was impossible. Yet the woman on that stage was not a figment of his imagination. The stunned, excited faces all around him were real. The name, Arthur Vance, Pediatric AI Research Wing, was real. "Richard, we have to go." Isabella's voice was sharp, cutting through his stupor. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fury. The doe-eyed adoration was gone, replaced by the hard, calculating look of someone whose investment was about to go bust. "Everyone is looking at us. This is a disaster." He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time that night, not as a beautiful object, but as a person, and saw the naked, selfish panic in her eyes. She wasn't worried about him. She was worried about her position, her reputation, the life she thought she was securing. "Get up, Richard," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "Do something, you look like a fool." He finally moved his limbs, stiff and heavy, as if moving through water. He stood up, his 6'2" frame, feeling small and exposed for the first time in his adult life. The moment he was on his feet, the illusion of privacy shattered. It was as if a signal had been given. The whispers stopped. The stolen glances became direct stares. He felt the full, crushing weight of their collective judgment. His rival Marcus Thorne chose that exact moment to stroll over a look of faux concern, plastered on his face that did nothing to hide the triumphant glint in his eyes. "Sterling," Marcus said, his voice dripping with condescending sympathy. "Quite a night. I had no idea your wife was such a powerhouse. Kept her hidden away all these years. Smart man." He chuckled, a low, cruel sound. "Or maybe not." Richard's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He wanted to wipe the smug look off Thorne's face, to reassert his dominance, but the words wouldn't come. His usual arsenal of witty retorts and cutting remarks had vanished. "Go to hell, Thorne," he managed to choke out. Marcus's smile widened. "Already there, my friend. Looks like you've just joined me. By the way, my board will be thrilled to hear about the instability in the Sterling household. They get so nervous about family-run businesses." He winked a final parting shot before turning and sauntering away victorious. The walk out of the ballroom was the longest walk of Richard's life. It was a gauntlet of averted eyes, pitying looks, and poorly concealed smirks. He kept his head high out of sheer stubborn pride, but he could feel his facade cracking with every step. Isabella walked slightly behind him, no longer on his arm, creating a small but significant distance between them. She was already detaching, insulating herself from the fallout. As they reached the grand foyer, they saw her. Eleanor. She was standing with a small group of people, including the Gala chair and the head of the St. Jude's board. She was laughing, a sound Richard hadn't heard from her in years, a genuine, unburdened laugh. She looked radiant, energized, alive. Standing beside her, holding her wrap, was a handsome, silver-haired man in an impeccably tailored suit. Richard recognized him with a sickening lurch. Julian Croft, one of the most ruthless but respected corporate lawyers in the city. Croft wasn't just a lawyer. He was a kingmaker. As Richard and Isabella passed, Julian Croft's eyes met Richard's. There was no sympathy there, only a cool, professional satisfaction. The look of a man whose long-term strategy had just paid off perfectly. Eleanor didn't even turn. It was the ultimate, most devastating cut. She had not only orchestrated his public humiliation, but she was now completely indifferent to his presence. He had been rendered irrelevant in his own life story. They stepped out into the damp night air. The flashes of the paparazzi cameras were now blinding, frenzied. The reporters smelling blood swarmed them. "Mr. Sterling, what did you think of your wife's announcement? Is it true you built your company on her father's work? Is this the end of your marriage? Who is your companion tonight, Mr. Sterling?" Richard pushed through them, shoving a camera out of his way, his face a grim mask of fury. He bundled a stunned Isabella into the back of the waiting Escalade and slammed the door, shouting the address of her apartment at the driver, not his. The ride was Sarantun, a suffocating vacuum filled with unspoken accusations and the death of an affair. The dream was over. The nightmare was just beginning. The interior of the Escalade, once a symbol of power and privacy, now felt like a pressurized coffin. The silence was thick and heavy, broken only by the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers against the persistent drizzle. Isabella sat pressed against the far door, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, a silent, furious statue of crimson silk. The woman who had gazed at him with such adoration was gone, replaced by a stranger with hard, accusing eyes. "Well," she finally snapped, her voice brittle, "are you going to say something, or are we just going to sit here in silence while my entire life goes up in flames?" Richard, who had been staring blankly at the blur of city lights, turned his head slowly to face her. His mind was still a maelstrom of shock and rage. "Your life," he scoffed, the sound raw and humorless. "You think this is about your life?" "Of course it is." She shot back, her voice rising. "I was at your side, Richard. At table 1. That was me on display next to you while your secret genius wife humiliated you in front of every important person in New York. What do you think that makes me look like I'm not just some girl? I'm a professional. I have a business, clients. You've made me a laughing stock. A cliché. A cliché. He laughed, a bitter barking sound that was more of a sob. You think you're a cliché, my wife, my quiet, timid wife, just announced to the world that my entire career is built on a lie, and you're worried about your interior design business. She didn't say your name. Isabella pointed out, her tone sharp and defensive. She was clever. She let everyone else fill in the blank. And they did. You saw their faces. You've been hiding a secret billionaire who was funding your entire life while you played king and paraded me around like a prize pony. The accusation, though wildly inaccurate in its specifics, struck a nerve because of its essential truth. He had paraded her around. He had treated his wife as a non-entity. You don't know what you're talking about, he snarled, falling back on his usual tactic of blustering denial. This is a stunt, a desperate cry for attention. I have no idea where she got that money, but it's a fantasy. She's been listening to her crazy old father's stories for too long. Oh, wake up, Richard, Isabella cried, her voice cracking with frustration. A fantasy. Did the standing ovation look like a fantasy? Did the Arthur Vance pediatric AI research wing sound like a fantasy? And that lawyer she was with, Julian Croft? He doesn't handle fantasies. He handles 9-figure divorces and hostile takeovers. You are in serious trouble, and you're sitting here talking about my business as if that's the problem. She was right, and that made him even angrier. He felt control, the one thing he valued above all else, slipping through his fingers like sand. He had been outmaneuvered, outplayed, and completely blindsided. For 20 years he had believed he was playing chess, while Eleanor wasn't even at the board. The horrifying truth was that she had been playing a completely different game, one with higher stakes and a longer strategy, and she had just declared checkmate. She has nothing. He insisted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He was trying to convince himself as much as her. Everything we have is in my name. The accounts, the properties, the company. She signed a prenuptial agreement, an ironclad one. She'll get the house in Greenwich and a stipend. That's it. Isabella stared at him, her expression turning from anger to something that looked a lot like pity. It was the last thing he wanted to see. A woman who can pull off a night like tonight, she said slowly, her voice devoid of its earlier heat, is not a woman who is worried about a prenuptial agreement. She didn't do this for a settlement, Richard. She did this to destroy you. And from where I'm sitting, it looks like she's going to succeed. The Escalade pulled up in front of her sleek modern apartment building in Soho. The doorman rushed out with an umbrella. For a moment, neither of them moved. The heated, intimate world they had built over the past year had evaporated, leaving behind a cold, awkward void. "Are you coming up?" Isabella asked, though the question lacked any real invitation. Richard looked at the building, then back at her face. He saw the calculation there, the rapid reassessment of his value. He was no longer a ticket to the top. He was a liability, a sinking ship she needed to abandon. "No," he said, his voice flat. "I have things to deal with." She nodded, a small, final gesture. She didn't say, "Call me." She didn't say, "I'm here for you." She simply opened the door and got out, disappearing under the doorman's umbrella without a backward glance. He was alone. He gave the driver the address for the Greenwich estate. The long drive out of the city felt like a retreat from a battlefield where he had suffered a catastrophic defeat. The Manhattan skyline, usually a symbol of his power and success, now seemed to mock him, its glittering lights like the triumphant eyes of his enemies. As the car ate up the miles on the dark, empty highway, his rage began to curdle into a cold, terrifying dread. What had Eleanor been doing all these years? While he was closing deals, traveling the world, and starting an affair. What had she been building in the quiet rooms of their sprawling home? The image of her at her little desk in the library, which he'd always found quaint, now seemed sinister. What secrets were held in the ledgers she kept? What plans were drafted on the laptop he'd bought her for Christmas 2 years ago, the one he assumed she used for recipes and online shopping? He arrived at the estate just before 2 a.m. The grand Tudor-style mansion was dark, save for a single light burning in the master suite upstairs, his and Eleanor's bedroom. He walked in through the massive front door, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous, silent foyer. The house felt different. It felt like her territory now. He took the sweeping staircase 2 steps at a time, his heart pounding in his chest. He was ready for a confrontation, a screaming match, a release for the torrent of fury and confusion coiling inside him. He threw open the bedroom door. The room was empty. The bed was perfectly made. On his pillow, propped up neatly, was a single thick envelope made of heavy cream-colored cardstock. His name, Richard, was written on the front in her elegant, familiar script. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside there were no angry letters, no emotional pleas. There were only 2 documents. The first was a legally filed petition for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. The second was a formal notice of an intellectual property lawsuit filed against Sterling Innovations by the Vanguard Legacy Foundation concerning the patent and derivative works of Arthur Vance. Both documents were signed by her lawyer, Julian Croft. They had been filed that morning. The entire gala, the speech, the humiliation. It wasn't the opening salvo. It was a victory lap. The war had been planned and executed in secret, and he hadn't even known it was being fought. He sank onto the edge of the bed, the crisp legal papers crinkling in his white-knuckled grip. The fight he was ready for was already over. He had already lost. The dawn brought no relief, only a grey, unforgiving light that seemed to seep through the mullioned windows of the Greenwich estate, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the silent air. Richard hadn't slept. He'd spent the night pacing the length of the master suite, the legal documents spread on the antique dresser like a declaration of war. The silence of the house was unnerving. He realized with a start that Eleanor's presence, which he had long taken for granted and deemed unremarkable, was in fact the subtle force that had made this massive house a home. Without her, it was just a collection of expensive objects in empty rooms. His first call, made as the sun crested the horizon, was to his own legal team. He got the head of his corporate counsel, a bulldog, of a man named Frank Peterson, on his private line. "Frank, it's Richard. We have a 5-alarm fire." He explained the situation in clipped, angry tones, the gala, the speech, the divorce petition, and most critically the IP lawsuit. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Frank finally spoke, his voice was heavy, stripped of its usual bravado. "Richard, I got a courtesy call from Julian Croft's office late yesterday afternoon. I was trying to reach you all evening. The suit is real, and it's not frivolous." "What the hell do you mean it's not frivolous?" Richard roared into the phone. "I own the patent. I bought it from Arthur Vance himself, fair and square." "You bought patent 7432888, the core compression algorithm," Frank said, his voice taking on the weary tone of a man delivering bad news. "The lawsuit Croft has filed alleges that Sterling Innovations' subsequent most profitable software suites were developed using derivative concepts and methodologies found in Vance's private research journals, journals that were not part of the patent sale. They claim you had access to them through your wife and knowingly committed industrial espionage and patent fraud." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. The notebooks. The rambling, chaotic notebooks filled with half-formed theories and complex equations he'd once mocked. He'd seen Eleanor studying them for years, transcribing them, organizing them. He had thought it was a sentimental hobby, a daughter's tribute to her father. "That's insane," he stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. "She can't prove that." "They seem to think they can," Frank said grimly. "Julian Croft doesn't bluff, Richard. He's submitted hundreds of pages of evidence for discovery. Annotated journals, dated digital files, even early email correspondence between you and Arthur. This has been in the works for a very, very long time." A wave of nausea washed over him. Every dismissive conversation, every time he had brushed her off when she tried to talk about her father's work, replayed in his mind, now cast in a sinister new light. She wasn't reminiscing. She was gathering intelligence. The second blow came an hour later. His CFO called. "Richard, we have a problem, a big one. The market opened an hour ago. We're down 9%. "It's a knee-jerk reaction to the gossip," Richard snapped. "It'll bounce back." "I don't think so," the CFO said, his voice strained. "The story isn't just gossip anymore. Beatrice Fairfax's column went live at 6 a.m. It's the lead story in the Financial Times. It's everywhere. The narrative is set, sterling innovations built on stolen genius. Our investors are spooked." He was right. By mid-morning, the financial news networks were running the story on a loop. They showed clips of Eleanor's poised, powerful speech, contrasted with blurry paparazzi photos of Richard storming out of the gala with a furious-looking Isabella. They had experts analyzing the lawsuit and legal scholars praising the brilliant airtight case constructed by Julian Croft. Then came the third, most personal blow. Richard, in a fit of rage, decided to cut Eleanor off. He would freeze their joint accounts, cancel her credit cards. He would show her that her foundation was nothing without his money. He logged into his private banking portal, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He pulled up their main joint investment account, an 8-figure portfolio he used for personal liquidity. A single line of text glowed on the screen. "Account closed." He stared, uncomprehending. He tried another, a savings account. Account closed. Frantically, he navigated through the portal. Every joint account had been systematically closed over the past 6 months. The funds had been transferred out. He pulled up the transaction history. The money had been moved legally and meticulously into a new set of accounts. Accounts held in trust by a law firm. Julian Croft's law firm. He remembered the papers he'd shoved in front of her a few months ago. "Just some tax restructuring," he'd said, not even bothering to explain. "Sign here, here, and here." She had signed without a word, her pen moving with its usual quiet efficiency. He had thought it was a sign of her trust, her submission. He saw now it was the final step in her masterful plan. She had used his own arrogance and dismissiveness against him, getting him to authorize the very transactions that would fund his own destruction. The prenuptial agreement he had been so proud of, the one that protected his assets, was now a weapon against him. It had stipulated a clear separation of premarital assets and any assets generated independently during the marriage. For 20 years he assumed she had none. But Eleanor hadn't just been organizing her father's old notes. She had used them, working with a small secret team funded by a modest inheritance from her mother that he'd never bothered to ask about. She had patented her father's derivative works under her own name, Eleanor Vance. She'd then licensed that technology quietly and strategically through shell corporations to burgeoning tech firms in Asia and Europe, markets he had considered secondary. While he was focusing on conquering America, She was quietly building a global empire in his shadow. The Vanguard Legacy Foundation wasn't just funded by a donation. It was the parent company of a multi-billion-dollar technology licensing firm. The sterling facade had not just crumbled, it had been revealed as a hollow shell. His reputation was in tatters. His company was under siege. His stock was in free fall. And his wife, the woman he had underestimated for 2 decades, held all the cards. She had not only left him, she had, in a single, devastatingly brilliant move, become his direct and most formidable competitor. He was alone in a vast, silent house that no longer felt like his, staring at a computer screen that confirmed his utter and absolute ruin. A week later, the storm had not hussassed. It had intensified into a Category 5 hurricane. Sterling Innovations' stock had plummeted by over 30%, wiping out billions in market value. The board, once a collection of his loyal yes-men, was in open revolt, calling for an emergency meeting to discuss his future as CEO. The IP lawsuit was a guillotine hanging over the company's head, freezing potential partnerships and scaring off investors. Richard's life, once a monument to success, was now a frantic damage control operation. He had tried to fight back. He'd hired a notoriously aggressive PR firm, which issued statements decrying the baseless and slanderous accusations of a scorned wife. But the narrative was too powerful, too compelling. Eleanor was David. He was Goliath. And everyone was rooting for David. Isabella was gone, of course. She had sent a single text message 3 days after the gala. "I'm sorry, Richard, but I can't be a part of this mess." He hadn't bothered to reply. She was a symptom of his arrogance, and the disease itself was now consuming him. The final meeting was not one of his choosing. It was arranged by the lawyers, not in a boardroom or a grand office, but in the neutral, sterile environment of a downtown mediation center. When Richard walked in, he felt a decade older. His expensive suit hung on him. His face was gaunt, and the confident swagger that had defined him was gone, replaced by a weary, haunted tension. Eleanor was already there, sitting at the long mahogany table next to Julian Croft. She looked serene. Dressed in a simple but elegant cream-colored business dress, she exuded a quiet authority that filled the room. She was no longer the ghost from the gala. She was the architect of this new reality. "Richard," she said, her voice even and calm. It was the first time she had spoken to him directly since that night. The sound of it, so familiar, yet so foreign, sent a shiver down his spine. "Eleanor," he replied, his voice hoarse. "What do you want?" "This isn't about what I want anymore, Richard," she said, gesturing to a stack of files in front of Julian. "This is about what is going to happen." Julian Croft took over his voice, the epitome of professional detachment. He laid out the terms of the settlement. They weren't a negotiation. They were a verdict. Eleanor was not contesting the prenuptial agreement. She didn't need to. She was, as Croft explained already, independently wealthier than Richard. The divorce would be simple and clean. She wanted nothing from him. Not the house, not the art, not a penny of his money. The house in Greenwich, she explained, would be sold with the proceeds donated to a women's shelter. The true devastation lay in the terms of the IP lawsuit settlement. "The Vanguard Foundation will drop the lawsuit under one condition," Croft stated, looking Richard dead in the eye. "That Sterling Innovations issues a full and public retraction of its founding story. You will acknowledge in a press release and in your SEC filings the foundational contributions of Arthur Vance to your core technologies." Richard stared at him aghast. That would destroy the company. It would be an admission of guilt. It's an admission of truth, Eleanor interjected, her voice cutting through the legal jargon. It's what you should have done 20 years ago. Croft continued. Furthermore, a controlling interest of Sterling Innovations, 51% of all voting shares will be transferred to a new holding company. He slid a document across the table. A holding company, managed by the Vanguard Legacy Foundation. Richard felt the last of the air leave his lungs. You want to take my company? No, Richard, Eleanor said, and for the first time a flicker of the woman he once knew was in her eyes. Not softness, but a profound, deep-seated weariness. I don't want your company. I'm saving it. Your leadership has made it vulnerable. Your arrogance has made it a target. The board is already preparing to oust you. This way the company survives, the employees keep their jobs, and my father's legacy is finally secured. You, however, will be required to step down as CEO effective immediately. It was the end. A total unconditional surrender. He had no leverage, no moves left to make. Frank Peterson, his own lawyer, sitting beside him, simply gave a slow, defeated nod. This was the only way out that didn't involve complete corporate collapse and potential criminal charges. Why? Richard finally whispered the question, not directed at the lawyer, but at her. After all these years, Eleanor, why like this? Eleanor leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table. Her gaze was unflinching. You think this was about the affair, don't you? You think this was about Isabella? She asked, a sad, knowing smile on her face. Richard, Isabella was just a symptom. This started long before her. It started the day you came back from my father's funeral and told me his notebooks were a lovely memento. It grew every time you patted my head and called my ideas cute. It solidified every time you introduced me as the little woman who handles the important things like what color to paint the dining room. You didn't just neglect our marriage, Richard. You erased me from my own life. You took my father's legacy, you took my ideas, and you left me with an allowance and a garden to tend. An affair is a betrayal of the body. You committed a betrayal of the soul. She stood up, her movement signaling the end of the meeting, the end of their life together. I didn't do this to destroy you, she said, her voice now softer, but no less final. I did this to build myself. You just happened to be in the way. With that, she turned and walked out of the room, followed by her lawyer. She didn't look back. Richard Sterling remained at the table, a king deposed, staring at the documents that signed away his empire. He had flown too close to the sun, blinded by his own brilliance, never realizing that the quiet, steady planet he'd left behind was not just reflecting his light, but was in fact a star of its own, brighter, hotter, and powerful enough to burn his entire world to the ground. He had lost everything, not to a rival or a market crash, but to the one person he was sure he owned. And in the crushing silence of the mediation room, he finally understood the terrifying power of a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to build. The story of Richard and Eleanor Sterling is a gripping tale of power, betrayal, and the spectacular rebirth of a woman who was written off. It's a stark reminder that the people we underestimate often possess a strength we cannot possibly imagine. Eleanor didn't just get revenge. She reclaimed her own story, her father's legacy, and built a new future from the ashes of a life that was meant to keep her small. Her victory wasn't in Richard's destruction, but in her own magnificent creation. What do you think is the most powerful lesson from Eleanor's long game? Was her takedown a masterclass in strategy or a tragedy born from years of neglect? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story captivated you and you want more tales of dramatic twists and poetic justice, please show your support. Hit that thumbs up button to give it a like, share it with someone who loves a story of empowerment, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to ring that notification bell so you won't miss our next video. Thank you for listening.